how do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women, that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chapulati, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by feeding all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.
Hello. This is greeneconomy.tv. My name is Gordon Brown, and welcome to the Circular Economy Show, joined as always by our expert guest, Chris Whyte, Director of the African Circular Economy Network, an alliance, I beg your pardon. Today we're going to be speaking about PET. We're going to be speaking about polyethylene and polypropylene as part 3 of our series on plastics and the circular economy. Before I introduce Chris and get started, I want to play you a short clip just to give us some nice context. It's not specifically about these 3 materials, but it's about plastics and the circular economy, produced by the Holland Circular Hotspot. So let's play you that video clip and give you that context. Thank you.
Plastic is an amazing invention, but it is also one of the largest environmental threats. Circular strategies have proven their potential to create climate-friendly solutions for the plastic industry, and best practices can be found all around the world, each one of them solving various steps of the value chain and reducing the carbon footprint. Think of 100% mechanically recycled food-grade bottles, simply eliminating plastics in the design phase of the value chain. Think also of new business models developing a logistic chain allowing for reuse of packaging while keeping it convenient and affordable for the consumer. Or of new models for demand and use, such as a refill model coming directly at the consumer's doorstep and leaving the choice of quantity to the consumer. But also of game-changing upcycling initiatives empowering local waste pickers, and closing the loop with innovating technologies allowing to transform all type of used plastics into virgin quality PET. All these separate initiatives can make a global impact. What are the conditions for change? The conditions for opportunities to scale, and for new collaborations to emerge.
Welcome, Chris, as always.
Thank you, Gordon. Nice to see you again.
Likewise. And so just to give us a little bit of background, we are in a 3-part series on plastics and the circular economy. In the first episode, we really asked you to give us an overview. We looked at the various types of your sort of typical plastic groups. Last week, we focused on some of the less recyclable of the more commonly found plastics, and this week we've moved on to those plastics that are more recyclable, and specifically speaking about PET and the polyolefins as 2 groups of plastics. So Chris, perhaps let's start with PET. Give us a sense, give us a bit of an introduction into the this material. What do we typically use this for? How do we typically encounter this material? And what is the current state of play in South Africa in respect of just how circular the economy is, just how effective we're being in terms of the processes there?
Sure, that's a lot of questions.
So PET is polyethylene terephthalate, probably one of the most versatile plastics in the market, and we're all very aware of it in terms of the bottling industry. So our Coca-Cola, our water, these all come in PET containers, and a whole host of new materials are coming into PET containers. It's a very versatile material. It's got a high strength, and it's lightweight, and from that perspective has been the sort of packaging of choice for many, specifically liquid packaging providers and retailers. So PET has evolved over time. I think if we look at it from a circular economy perspective, the biggest thing that's happened from a PET perspective is that the weight of the bottles has changed. So over time, the design side of things is looking at using less plastic for the same efficiency or the same application. But that really helps the manufacturer. That doesn't really help from a recycling perspective, because it just means that the bottles are lighter. So you've got to collect more bottles to get the same weight. But the big thing is that we've got a very successful producer responsibility organization in this country on PET called PETCO. Been around for over a decade, and they've done some amazing stuff. So over a decade ago, we were drowning in PET plastic waste, and they basically brought together most of the big manufacturers in the PET industry. So it was a voluntary application. And their focus has seen the increase going up to sort of 60% kind of range with regards to PET collection. So brilliant from where we've come. The issue is, of course, that is just on PET bottles. So, PETCO is not called a PET bottling recycling company. It's called PETCO. So we need to address the other PET issues. We have a number of different PET components that we often don't think about that are less recyclable. For example, the thermoform PET packaging, like the clear plastic one would see typically with the supermarket salad that one's getting. It's sort of a crinkly plastic. Very difficult to recycle and problematic from that perspective. But there are other PET components that are not recycled either. So a lot of our oil comes in 2 to 5 liter containers. That doesn't go into the same system. Our water bottles, 25 liter water bottles, are PET. Those don't go into the same recycling system. So there's a lot of exclusions to the system. But PETCO has really been about looking at the voluntary association to address the issues around the existing manufacturers, and they've done a great job around that. We need to now expand that to all of the other PET components. And of course, understand it's important.
Yeah, so sorry, I was going to say, I guess one can understand a voluntary EPR is it functions as a mandate of its members, and so so you're talking about bottling and the bottlers, and we understand, of course, that PETCO's members come from that sector. But one would think, talk to me about these salad trays or plastic sandwich, packaged sandwich plastic wrappers that one gets. I always wonder myself whether these things are actually recyclable. I stand there and stare at them before I put them in my recycling. Often they've got paper stuck on them and other things going on. So are you saying that these items are, in fact, firstly, they're made from PET, they're highly recyclable? What is the reason that these items are not being included?
Well, the simple reality is that there's no current infrastructure for recycling those different components. They're also a lot more difficult because of the process of thermoform PET is less applicable to remanufacturing back into bottle-grade PET. So it's a process from the design perspective. We are seeing a lot of move now for people to move away from that. The big issue is that where you look at source separation programs or these community collection programs, the housewife, you or I, think this is a really nice, clear-looking plastic. It's got to be ideal for recycling. And unfortunately, the poor guys at the recycling side of things are having to manage all of this product and then dump it at the end of the day because there's no market for it. So that is a big problem from our perspective. And we are seeing moves. There are certain sustainable retailers that are doing some very clever stuff in terms of moving towards design for recyclability. So they are replacing the thermoform PET with a polypropylene from a very highly recyclable perspective. But we need to address those key issues. So yes, we can talk about the bottles and how successful we are at that, but then we need to understand the full value chain. We need to look at all the different PET in the market and understand where we're coming from. And that was really unpacked from a perspective. We've always talked about, if you look at our voluntary PROs, was very much that we were up there with Europe with the level of plastics recycling. But if you look at works done by Professor Harrow from Blotnitz and others, UCT, who look at it from an overall perspective, I mean, our recycling rates are not in the 60s and 70s. They're probably closer to 13 to 15% overall. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But the EPR has also understood that. So the extended producer responsibility is about trying to broaden that net. Understanding that PET is not just about the bottle, it's about the other products. There are other products that can come out from PET in terms of strapping, in terms of fiber, and they don't necessarily have to go back into bottle grades. So we can look at different upcycling technologies where PET can be used to form a fiber that can go into building insulation. Or other components can go into applications around geotextile manufacturing. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at it. But the problem is that the market hasn't, the infrastructure is not there to manage all of those at the moment. So we're working towards that. I think everybody in the industry will acknowledge that these are the issues, and we need to work towards that. But the EPR also being now gazetted means that it's not just about the volunteers, it's widening the net to all the PET producers and the other polyolefin producers.
So, with the EPR coming in, can we then anticipate that, at collection points, there's going to be a much greater amount of these additional PET products? What's going to happen to them? What are the opportunities for existing PET recyclers? What is the opportunity for new players to come in to address or to treat these additional waste streams that we would anticipate piling up at the collection points?
Again, it comes down to understanding supply and demand. Very simple fact of not only local but also global applications that we have no control over. I'll give you a prime example. At the beginning of this year in January, with some of our recycling partners, we were able to get about R1.60 a kilogram for PET. That price is now back up to about R5.60, R5.70 a kilogram. So it's back in line with what makes it economically viable. But we've got to stabilize that variation in pricing. And again, EPR is a key component to making sure that there is stability in the pricing for the collector. So that has a knock-on effect. When they stop collecting it because it doesn't have a value, it means the stocks go down. It means that when the demand comes back, the products aren't there, and it causes havoc in the whole system. So EPR is also about looking to try and level out the playing field with regards to the highs and lows and the sine wave that one gets in any recycling industry. So we've got to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, so it's a very good point, and I understand that PETCO, for one, and it plays a great role in supporting the recyclers, the people that invest in the technologies required to recycle the plastics. That companies like PETCO support these manufacturers by supporting the economics and supporting the collector to ensure that the supply is there at the right price. Maybe just talk a little bit about that and the role that companies like PETCO play in supporting, their industries, if you like.
They play a vital role. And I think that the issue is to understand the holistic picture. And of course, while they were looking at it from a voluntary perspective, that does limit their outlook. But being sort of directed through these gazetted requirements to look at the overall picture means that they now need to take a broader view. But you need an organization like PETCO to be able to be the brains behind the assessment to understand what those difficulties are and what the opportunities are. As we've mentioned before, plastics are extremely complicated. But if we look at the opportunity where they can start to understand and define what the infrastructure requirements are, That's what's going to drive supply and demand. The simple reality is that if we look at our current infrastructure in terms of what's required from a bottle PET back into an rPET or another bottle PET, the infrastructure is pretty much in place for that, and there are opportunities for growth within that. But then we need to look at other alternatives. So with the other PET, you've got the colored PET, which is a lower value, again, designed for recyclability. Get rid of brown and green bottles. It just doesn't make sense. So look at the design side of things, but then also look at other applications. And PET has a number of different applications. As I said, it can go into fiber, which can go into the building industry. It can go into clothing industry from a low-end perspective. But there's also a number of different international markets. And the reality is that the markets are not closed. Everyone says, well, China's doors are closed. No, they're not. They're not going to take the empty, dirty bottle, but they're certainly going to buy clean washed flakes. So the opportunity in the market is there. EPR drives it from a demand perspective because the focus is to increase the rPET levels or the percentages. So what we call globally more the PCR content or the post-consumer resin content, to bring that back into the bottling system. Now, by defining those within the EPR means that there are goals that they need to achieve by certain dates to increase that amount of recyclate within new products. But you've got to have the right product for it, and you've got to have the right infrastructure for it. So we've got to look at how we drive that whole process forward. And in doing so, it also allows us the opportunity to understand where the gaps are in the market. But then technology is brilliant. We've got to look at other applications. There's chemical recycling initiatives coming through, specifically around PET, which are very exciting. That would allow for almost endless bottle-to-bottle recycling. Again, we need to understand the costs of that. But there are other systems for the problematic fractions where one could look at waste to energy or upcycling or downcycling type initiatives. So we've got to unpack the full value chain right across the different PET products into the market.
Chris, let's move across to polyolefins and to start chatting about some of the key plastics in that sector and then in that segment. And let's perhaps start with polyethylene. Give us a sense of that material. What are we using it for and how recyclable is it and how are we set up in this country to handle that material?
Sure. Polyolefins obviously comprises two main components. You've got the polyethylenes and the polypropylenes. And they are probably the most versatile of packaging materials, and they are pretty much everywhere. So polyethylene comes in two main types. One would call HDPE or high-density polyethylene and LDPE or low-density polyethylene. Your HDPE would typically be your milk bottle would be an HDPE. Some ice cream containers also use HDPE. But your low density is more in your film packaging. So your blister packs, the cling film, the film wrap, the plastic bag, your shopping bags that you use, and those are all very, very recyclable. Again, the designing for recyclability is a key issue. We've all seen certain, again, not to mention names, but certain brand owners in the retail sector coming up with their own 100% recycled bags. We've got product definers in the market like Tuffy, who have been very strong about creating their range of bags from 100% recycled materials. And they can compete in the market. And again, it's because that they are at that level in terms of the infrastructure requirements and the scales of economy to make that. So it is definitely achievable. But then we need to understand that we can't start putting all sorts of other rubbish into these materials. The biggest issue we have at the moment is fillers. So we use calcium carbonate quite a lot as a filler, up to 30% into these materials to try and reduce the cost of the polymer. And whilst the sort of threshold for about 30% doesn't jeopardize the strength or the technical application of the material, it certainly creates complications within the recycling sector.
So how does how do we address that? I mean, so we've got that goes back to the design for recyclability question. What is the level of saving that you might experience from using a filler instead of using 100% of the polymer? Are there some mechanisms that one can bring through to incentivize companies to not do that? I mean, how prevalent is that? We don't want to disappear down a rabbit hole here, but how big of a deal is it, this mixing of polymers, which affects the recyclability for this particular material?
It's a huge problem. Effectively, it's about commercial competition. So if you can produce your product slightly cheaper than the guy next door, it means that you are at an economic advantage. And that's where policy comes in as a key player. If we have policy in place that means you're all going to work towards the same standard and we're not going to use fillers, then you've got to compete on a competitive basis based on your lean manufacturing processes or on just having sort of well-structured business models, rather than trying to get cheaper on the material. That's really what we want to try and drive for, and designing for recyclability is about that. And ultimately, it's going to have a cost impact in terms of the consumer. But I think we're all going to have to pay at the end of the day to make sure that we make sure these materials are going into the recycling system at their maximum value. That would then negate this cherry-picking society issue that we have with regards to the varying values of the different recyclable commodities in the market. So it's important for us to be able to try and level the playing field. And that's where policy is important. And that's where also it's not only policy in terms of local manufacturing, but it's policy in terms of what we import. And we're seeing that now through European directives. But that means that we can't give a cheap Southeastern Asian product precedent over something because it's cheaper. We need to follow the same rules in terms of our import policies on different products as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do it, and policy directives, but also key elements around the producer responsibility organizations like PETCO, which is in charge of the polyolefins, been doing a great job, but we need to give them the means to look at the bigger problem and address issues around creating supply, demand, infrastructure, and applications.
Yeah. So from your perspective, I mean, how does one address that? From a policy point of view, we've got the new EPRs. Are those regulations going to address that? Is that system the system now that we're going to change, or we're going to evolve and adapt and to comply with the new regulations? Is this going to go some way to beginning to solve the problems, in your opinion?
Yeah, we certainly hope so. I mean, that's the whole purpose behind it. I think what we're going to see is a lag. Typical African fashion, we're going to wait until the last minute before we do anything. So the regulations were promulgated in May this year. And I think by the 5th of November, any importer, brand owner, producer, manufacturer has to be compliant and aligned with a PRO and linked into an EPR. So in typical fashion, I envisage a last minute rush, probably in the last week of July. But I think that the line has been drawn in the sand. And that's the important thing. But it is going to take us a while to work into the EPR as to what actually works and what doesn't. And a big fear in the industry at the moment is that we're creating a system that is going to be immovable. And I think we need to understand that nowhere on the planet has EPR been put into place and worked after day one. It changes over time to accommodate the requirements, not only of the consumer, but also of the policymaker and the brand owner and the producer. So there's a balance that needs to be played. So we've got to look at all of the economic requirements across the value chain, from the producers of the raw materials to the manufacturers, the brand owners, the distributors, the importers, to the consumer, and what's right for the consumer. But in order to underpin the value in the recycling sector, we've got to look at these critical issues. And that's where the PROs are going to play a vital role. And in the case of the plastics we're talking about this week, that would be PETCO and POLYCO. and how they drive and direct that. And they work with everybody in the industry. They're very open to suggestions. Everyone's always looking at what's new on the technology side. So I'm very positive about it, but there's going to be a learning curve to go through, and I think we need to understand that.
Yeah, let's talk about the opportunities for a moment. I mean, so what we're talking about here is under these EPRs, we're going to have more materials. We're going to have other materials that perhaps have been ignored in the selection process now arriving, accumulating, potentially achieving critical mass volumes. Where do you see the opportunities? I mean, if you were the Elon Musk of the waste industry, I mean, what would you invest in? What do you see as the opportunities? This new sector that's now going to hopefully flourish and burgeon, in spite of the underlying risks which we understand in the recycling sector around the price of raw materials and so forth. Where do you see the opportunities?
I think that there's massive opportunities, and I think anybody in the industry would agree with me that there's two sides to the story. So you're always going to get those anti-plastic people. It's like the anti-vaxxers. There's always going to be somebody with an argument, but there's a counter argument to every argument. Plastic's here to stay. We've got to understand that. The simple reality is that we've invested globally another $200 billion into new plastics manufacture, which is going to increase the plastics output by 40% over the next decade. It's coming. We need to manage it. But it's about trying to manage it and understand that we put all the role players and all the stakeholders together so that we're looking at a system that's going to work for everybody. And that's a difficult balance to try and get to. But if I did have my magic wand, I would certainly look at the issue in terms of driving it from the perspective of creating an equal playing field across the different plastic value chains. First of all, design for recyclability. Let's get rid of the problematic plastics. We don't need them. But then have all of the infrastructure into place where we could become completely independent with regards to our own plastics recycling. And that would be upcycling, chemical recycling, downcycling, recycling, all the different components that fit into the circular economy. And then whatever doesn't fit at the end of the day, there are fantastic applications through alternative building materials, looking at things like plastic roads, the opportunity for pyrolysis to create fuels, looking at gasification directly into energy. Nothing should be going to landfill. Yeah.
Well, Chris, I think let's leave it there. I mean, what a great conclusion to that. I think that we've run out of time. I really appreciate your input on these super important and highly recyclable plastics. So, ladies and gentlemen, next week, same place, same time for the Circular Economy Show. We'll have a special guest next week. Brenda Roberts, Sustainability Director of Waste Management Company Averda, will be joining Chris and I for a conversation. Don't miss it. Be there. 10 o'clock Wednesday next week. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have today. Thanks again to Chris. See you next week.
How do we grow this influence of black leaders, men and women that can represent our industry inside the ANC, inside the policy-making structures?
Get to grips with the digital environment, put together best practices, what works and what doesn't, very importantly.
In the project that we're doing in Chaplat, we've created a linking bridge between those two little areas there. So it becomes a matter of just 10 minutes walk from one side to the other.
So my message to our CEOs and those chief investment officers is, where at the end of the day do you want to see your role?
So by feeding all of our water back to a stage where we can bring it back into the process, we're in effect saving around about 35% of our water usage on site.